It has been reported, for instance, that regions with higher levels of disease prevalence tend to be associated with higher levels of social conformity and autocratic rule. Individuals who feel more vulnerable to disease likewise report higher levels of ethnocentrism and xenophobia. Now, that's something else to consider. So, I don't know if you know this, but when the Spaniards landed in Central America, they had been from a European population that was concentrated in cities, and the cities were, from our perspective, disgusting, filthy, close proximity with animals, and subject to continual waves of epidemic disease. Now, the upside of that for the Europeans was that all the ones that didn't die developed immunity to these various diseases, even though, I would suspect that over time it was the majority of people who died from one epidemic disease or another. Well, so then the Spaniards went to the New World. Well, for one reason or another, there were hardly any epidemic diseases in North America. Now, that was partly because of a relative dearth of domestic animals, and partly because there weren't as many big, closely packed cities, but, God only knows what the overall reason was. So what happened? All the Native Americans died. 95% of them. They died from smallpox, they died from measles, they died from mumps, they died from chicken pox in successive waves of epidemic demolishment centered in Central America and radiating out all across North America and South America. So that by the time the Europeans landed in, because the Spaniards got there, say, in the late 1400s, right? Early 1500s. And so the people who landed at Plymouth Rock, and that's kind of often what you think about as the beginning of the European colonization of North America, that was like 100 years later. Well, everyone was dead by then. And there are reports that when the white settlers, the religious escapees really, landed at Plymouth Rock, the natives were happy to see them because there weren't enough people left bringing the crops. So why am I telling you this? Well, and in return, syphilis was delivered to Europe. At least that's the theory. Although it's not, there isn't any certainty about that, but it seemed to appear at about the same time. So the Europeans brought endless numbers of horrible diseases to the New World, and then the New World returned the favor with one horrible disease. But there's a point here. Well, and this still happens. So if you go into the Amazon, you find a tribe that, hasn't been discovered yet, or anywhere else in the world, and you go up and you shake their hand, it's like, that's great, but they're all dead in like a month. So why is this important? Well, we don't know how often this sort of thing has happened in the past. And so it could easily be the case that part of the reason that people are leery of people who aren't like them is because over the course of our evolutionary history, it was at least moderately probable that if you ran into another group of people, even if they didn't kill you and you immediately went to war, that the mere contact would devastate you. And you can imagine how that sort of thing would be attributed to things like magical power or curses or, whatever have you, when people are trying to strive for an explanation for the phenomenon. So, that's a nasty little idea. Now, check this out. So this study according to a parasite stress hypothesis, authoritarian governments are more likely to emerge in regions characterized by a high prevalence of disease-causing pathogens. Recent cross-national evidence is consistent with this hypothesis, but there are inferential limitations associated with that evidence. We report 2 studies that address some of these limitations and provide further tests of the hypothesis. Study 1 revealed that parasite prevalence strongly predicted cross-national differences on measures assessing individuals' authoritarian personalities, and that this effect statistically mediated the relationship between parasite prevalence and authoritarian governance. Okay, so let's unpack that. What does it mean? More disease, the more the people are authoritarian. The more the people are authoritarian at the local level, at the level of their individual beliefs, the more likely the government is to be authoritarian. So it's disease, individual, government. Right. So that's really something. Study 2 tested the parasite stress hypothesis in a sample of traditional small-scale societies. Results revealed that parasite prevalence predicted measures of authoritarian governance, and did so even when statistically controlling for other threats to human welfare. One additional threat, famine, also uniquely predicted authoritarianism. Yeah, but I should also point out that the historical reasons for famine were often tightly associated with the historical reasons for disease prevalence. So, if you were invaded by rats, they were going to eat everything that you produced, and the probability that they were going to bring disease along with them was pretty damn high. But look at the correlations. Together, these results further substantiate the parasite stress hypothesis of authoritarianism and suggest that societal differences in authoritarian governance result in part from cultural differences in individuals' authoritarian personalities. Okay, what's the correlation between authoritarian governance and pathogen prevalence? 0.42. Remember what we said about effect sizes. That's as powerful an effect as the relationship between IQ and grades. It's a whopping effect. And there's a lot of error in these measurements, so you can be sure that the true correlation is higher. Famine was also associated with authoritarian governance. Wow. I read that paper and I thought, really? Could that really be the case? Is that what happens is that, especially as the incidence of transmissible diseases increase, people clamp down on their moral structures. They don't they don't allow contact they tighten the borders at every level. So, one of the things that indicates, and this is mind-boggling, who would have guessed this, is that perhaps the best way to fight authoritarianism across the world is to institute effective public health programs and get rid of the infectious diseases. Now, who would have guessed that? But, it makes sense to some degree. If the general level of danger and threat is actually lowered, maybe people don't have to be so defensive and, and judgmental and xenophobic.